Hello, dear viewers. Support me by subscribing to my channel and share my video if you like it. And also, make sure you comment your thoughts. Now let's start the video.
You think it a bad offer, my lady? Aegon asked. I think it a fool's one. Lord Snow and Sansa Stark is not my queen. Lyanna Mormont said. You didn't kneel, Dany asked, raising an eyebrow and looking at her. I've knelt to the only king or queen of the north I intend to, Lyanna said, looking to him, Aegon giving her a small nod which she returned. Your offer, my lady? Dany asked curiously. A king for a queen, your grace, Lyanna said, and Aegon shook his head, a small smirk on his face. Continue, Lady Mormont. Dany said, her own smile present too. I and the other northern lords will once again name Lord Snow king in the north, your grace. We will do so under the agreement that he and you are to be wed. We'll accept you as our queen by marriage, just as the rest of the 7 kingdoms will accept Jon Snow as your king the same way. Why would we give you this? We have no need of your men, nor a need to protect them, Tyrion said angrily. Silence, you do not speak for me, Lord Hand. You'll keep your thoughts and words to yourself unless I ask for them, is that understood? Dany said. Why? I said, is that understood? Dany raised her voice and Tyrion nodded. An interesting proposal, my lady, and a far more agreeable one than the one Lord Snow's sister sent. But do you speak for all the lords of the north? Dany asked. Enough of them, your grace. I care not for this, truly. Subterfuge and politics of this nature are a southern thing. I, like Lord Snow, was raised to believe that the north valued honor above dishonor. Our word was our bond, and what we said we'd live and die by. Jon Snow tells me there is an army of dead men coming my way, that to survive it we need his queen's help, then I believe him. But I swore to follow a Stark, my lady, one with the blood of the kings of winter in their veins. So give us back our king, your grace, and you have my fealty and the fealty of the north, Lyanna said. Could you give me a few moments, my lady? Perhaps you and your cousin can speak together. I'm sure Sir Jorah would welcome the opportunity. Your grace, Lyanna said, and Dany nodded as she turned to leave. I'll speak to you in a moment. Arya Ghost is around here somewhere, he said, and Arya too turned to leave, mentioning something about Gendry that he barely heard. They were no sooner out of the tent than Tyrion began. Aegon watching as Dany grew angrier and angrier as he spoke. You cannot contemplate this, your grace. They bring nothing to the table, they need our help and are willing to offer any words that would bring you back to them. This is obviously done with Sansa Stark's approval. It's far too coincidental that both arrived together. Jon, she asked, I may be biased here, your grace. A marriage and a crown seems to be what the North wishes me to have, he said, rolling his eyes. Dany's smirk telling him she understood his jape. Exactly. Was this your plan, Snow? To force our queen into this? Manipulate her into giving you what you want? Tyrion said. The slap he hit him with knocked him to the ground. Missandei, Grey Worm, Varys, and even Dany looking at him shocked. You really think so little of my queen to think she can be manipulated? Or is it you fear that your own manipulations are no longer working as well as you wish? Her grace and I have had this discussion before, Lord Tyrion. Why didn't you suggest a marriage, an alliance between the North and the Queen? What reason did you have for not bringing it up? You were a bastard, aye, but one that held a crown. How is it a 3-10 named-old girl understands politics better than the hand of the queen? He asked, and Tyrion didn't reply. Leave us, all of you, Dany said, and Tyrion went to complain, all of you. Once they had gone, he turned to look at her with an apologetic look on his face, one which she waved off as she did the words he spoke. I should not have done that, he said softly. Had you not, then I may have, she said, looking to him. This offer, Aegon, you think it true? I had hoped they'd come to their senses. Everything I'd done was to see it so, though I'd not dared hope them to come around so fully. I wanted them to accept my queen. I'd not thought they had another way to see it done. The North is proud, Dany, for all Lyanna spoke of its honor, for all I believed in it. Its pride is just as strong, and I see that now. You wish us to turn back? She asked. We came here to bring the North to your side and to save it from what's coming for it. It seems we're about to see the first is done, and that gives us a chance for the second, he said, moving to her. So we're to marry then? She asked with a smile as he kissed her. A wedding in a godswood at night is a wondrous sight. Will you marry me, Dany? He asked, and she nodded. Well, if I must. But only for a crown, Aegon. she said, giggling when he picked her up. They called the others in and he saw Lyanna look to them both, nervous and yet eager for their words. "What of Lady Sansa, my lady?" Dany asked. "Upon your return she will willingly give up her crown or be unnamed publicly, your grace. Lord Wyman and the other lords will have explained the situation to her by now. Do we have an accord?" Lyanna asked hopefully. "We do, Lady Lyanna. His Grace and I intend to fly to Last Hearth to see to the evacuations. I'll leave orders with our armies to turn and head back to Winterfell. You may accompany them if you wish." "I will, thank you, your grace," Lyanna said to Dany. "Your grace," she said with a smile as she bowed to him and turned to leave. Dany ordered Grey Worm and Quhono to make ready to march back, Varys looking on, seeming even more pleased than usual. Aegon knew they were now closer to him, being completely on their side. After speaking to Missandei and Jor, and after a tense discussion with Tyrion, she turned to head to the dragons, leaving him alone with Arya. "What do you think?" he asked nervously. "Of you being married or being a king again?" Arya smirked. "Of Sansa losing her crown. She won't be happy, but it's the right thing to do, Jon." "Aye, it is. Ride back with them, Arya. Speak to them as I said. We'll spend time together when I return. I'm so jealous of you. Getting to ride with the queen on her dragon, gods, what I wouldn't give for that," Arya said with a wistful look on her face. "If that makes you jealous, then what you're about to see will only do more so, but I promise to take you up there as soon as I can." Looking at her face and the face of the Northmen, at Lyanna's when he climbed up on Rhaegal's wing, he wondered what was going through their minds. No one had raised the fact he was flying on a dragon to him or to Dany, and he wondered just why that was. He knew Arya wouldn't let this slide, his sister looking at him with awe as he leaned down close to the dragon's head. Aegon could see her far more clearly than she had been up to now. She was in there and closer than ever to breaking free, his little sister smiling when Rhaegal took to the sky. Winterfell 305 AC, Jaime Lannister. He had kept to the side roads mainly, more so once he arrived in the north itself. Even dirty and tired as he was, Jaime knew that anyone who'd seen him would know him as a Lannister, and here in the north that would not be a good thing. When he reached Wintertown, he was surprised by the number of people in the small town. The last time he'd ridden through here, the place had partially been a village. Now it seemed a fully inhabited town for true. Given the things that lay north of the wall, he wondered had the people left their homes and came here for safety. He vaguely remembered Tyrion telling him something about that many years before. How in winter the town swelled in population. No one paid him any mind as he rode through, and then he saw the walls of Winterfell in front of him once more. Entering the gates, he couldn't help but be reminded of what it had felt like when he'd come here the first time. He climbed down off his horse and pulled down his hood, looking around to see the courtyard and almost being taken back to 7 years before. A different time and place where his children lived. He loved his sister, and his father and brother were by his side. He glanced down at the glove that covered his golden hand. He shook his head. There was no point dwelling on the past. Looking up, he saw a boy sitting in a wheeled chair, and it took a moment for him to recognize him. The small smile on his face soon gave way to a guilty, horrified look. "The things we do for love." The voice felt like it was calling him from the past as he looked to the boy and saw he was just staring ahead. Before he knew it, there were swords pointing at him, and as he looked at the Stark guards, he began to notice something he had not. Where were the Dothraki? The Queen's Unsullied? Where were the dragons? What the hell had he ridden into? Whatever it was, he was soon to find out as he watched the boy in the chair be wheeled inside and soon found himself following. The sword at his hip taken from him and a slap to his mouth, the only reply to his questions. Soon he was once again standing in the great hall of Winterfell and trying his best not to let old ghosts fill his thoughts, something made quite difficult when he looked at the red-headed woman sitting in pride of place. "Sir Jaime, why have you come here?" Sansa Stark asked, yet for Jaime he may as well have been back in that cage in the Riverlands. The woman in front of him could well have been her mother's twin. "I came to fight the dead, my lady," he said. "Your grace. You'll refer to our queen properly, Kingslayer," a gruff voice called out. "Forgive me, your grace, but I was under the impression that Jon Snow was king. Though given how quickly they fall, perhaps not," he said with a smirk. The slap to the back of his head was hard and almost dropped him to his knee. Your brother said you'd be bringing the Lannister army. I don't see an army with you, Sir Jaime. Sansa said, Jaime, smiling, knowing that Tyrion had come here. No, my sister is not one for keeping to her word. Though I'd love to see my brother once more. Is he here? He asked. No, your sister is not, so you've come alone. Sansa asked, not answering the question he asked. I have, your grace. I find I've no use for you, Sir Jaime. A one-handed swordsman doesn't really bring much to the table, and even were it not so, there are crimes you must answer for. Crimes? He asked curiously. You attacked my father in King's Landing, waged war on House Stark. Who waged war on my own house, lest you forget who started this war? Or did my brother kidnap himself? You tried to destroy my house, my family. Sansa said angrily. You want me to apologize? I won't. We were at war. Everything I did for my house and my family. I'd do it all again. The things we do for love, Bran Stark said, and Jaime felt himself gulp, waiting for what came next. You say we were at war, Sir Jaime. What happens to those who lose that war? What happens to that are taken prisoner? How would your father have treated my brother had he caught him? Harshly, your grace, he said. Take Sir Jaime to the dungeons. He'll be executed on the morrow. Your grace, please. Sir Jaime is an honorable man, I know this. When we were both taken prisoner, the men tried to force themselves on me. Sir Jaime defended me. One honorable act doesn't outweigh the many dishonorable ones, Lady Brienne. Guards. Sir Jaime is entitled to a trial by combat, your grace. I stand ready to act as his champion. Brienne said, and Jaime found himself looking at her, shocked and stunned that she'd do such a thing. Very well, on the morrow we'll hold a trial of combat. Until then, Sir Jaime will spend his time in the dungeons. Sansa said, standing up and turning to walk from the hall. He tried to speak to Brienne to get her to withdraw her offer, but he was practically dragged from the hall. Before he knew it, he was sitting on a stone bed in a cold, damp cell, and he laughed. It was better than a cage at any rate. The food he was given was pitiful, but at least it was warm, and after eating it he heard the door being opened. Looking up to see that Brienne was now standing in front of him. You shouldn't have done that, he said, and she glared at him, though I'm grateful for it. He smiled. Why did you come? She asked. I gave my word, but you were right, this goes beyond loyalty, this is about survival. Should I lose? She said softly. Unless it's Snow they have you face, you'll not. Speaking of the bastard of Winterfell, where is he? Have they moved to the wall already? He asked. He listened as she told him what Jon Snow had done, how he'd called out the North for their stupidity. Jaime found himself laughing at the idea that he'd turned and just rode away, taking the armies and dragons back south. Briefly, he worried about Cersei and the idea that they'd soon be facing his sister and the armies she'd brought to fight for her. He'll return, Jaime said, and Brienne looked at him. The Queen has sent men with an offer, but I doubt she'll be successful. Her brother's moves have vexed and confused her. Good, then he's learning, but that boy will fight for the North. He cares too much not to. You should rest, Brienne said, turning to leave. You're the one who's fighting, not me. You should be the one who's resting, he said, and she nodded as she left. He found himself unable to sleep, wondering if he was right about Jon Snow or ascribing to him something he'd lost in himself. That he worried about the fight on the morrow also keeping him awake. Not that in the end it mattered, as no one came for him on the morrow or the next day, and despite asking the guards, no one spoke to him or came for a few days after either. Winterfell 305 AC. Sansa. She had been in no mood to deal with Jaime Lannister, and was furious that Brienne had stepped up for him. A trial by combat was an impossibility for her, and Brienne had put her in a terrible position. That she had been the one to bring it up and offered to champion the Kingslayer had taken Sansa's own champion from her. It was only when she got back to her room that she realized that she should have demanded her sworn sword fight for her. While not officially a Queensguard, Brienne was one in all but name, and that she had now gone against her so publicly meant now she couldn't serve as one. No way could Sansa trust her after this. She'd shown her loyalties lay with Jaime Lannister over her. Were it the first time she had questioned her, then perhaps she could have let it go, but she'd done so over her handling of the Dragon Queen and Jon. She'd spoken about the dead being real and that without the dragons they were done for, as if she didn't understand that, whatever else she may think of Jon, he wasn't a liar. His own words and actions since he'd arrived at Winterfell only further emphasizing the truth of that. She knew what was coming for them, and she tried to prepare. Sitting down at her father's desk, she looked at the letter resting on it, the letter that she'd received turning down her proposal. Now knowing that she'd have to tell the northern lords about that too, the letter was probably going to cost her her crown. She picked it up and read it again, the words angering her greatly. Your Grace, while your offer is greatly tempting, I find I must decline. After speaking to your brother, he informs me he has no wish to be called a Stark. If anything, he desires never to be named as such. As for you offer to allow us to wed, it seems there is a custom amongst the free folk who still name your brother king. When a man or a woman desire to make someone theirs, they steal them, of course not in the literal sense. They carry them off, and though they may fight against it, it's not a true fight, and more to test the worthiness of those who try to steal them. It seems unbeknownst to me, but at least amongst the free folk they tell me that traveling beyond the wall to rescue him was in their eyes enough. So we cannot accept your permission, your grace, for it seems I've already stolen him from you. Daenerys Stormborn. The urge to rip the letter up or throw it in the fire was just as strong as it had been, and yet she couldn't quite bring herself to do either. She knew the lords were soon to find out, and she could only guess how they'd react. Lyanna Mormont had ridden off with some of her men. Where to she didn't know, but she could guess, and Arya had disappeared. Though that wasn't unusual, her sister came and went as she pleased, and Sansa wouldn't know where she was from one end of the day to the next unless she was standing right beside her. Bran was no help either, her brother even more obtuse and confusing than ever. As she was sitting in the solar, pondering her next move, the knock came to the door. A servant informing her that Lord Manderly wished to speak to her. Despite not wanting to speak to anyone, Sansa knew she had no choice. The Lord of White Harbor had not knelt, and given the Dragon Queen's answer, he may cause trouble. Nodding to the girl, she had her bring the fat lord in, Wyman looking every inch a walrus as he waddled to the chair and sat when she nodded to him. Your Grace, I've come on behalf of the other lords, Lord Wyman said, and Sansa felt her breath hitch. What is it my lords wish to discuss with me, Lord Manderly? Your brother and the Dragon Queen, your Grace. I know your offer to Lord Snow and Queen Daenerys was rejected. Your insight regarding your brother was wrong, your Grace. Now because of it, the North finds itself in the most perilous position it's ever been. My brother will return, my lord, she said decidedly, less assuredly than she'd wanted. He will, your Grace, but not based on your offer. Lord Snow will return based on mine, the fat lord said, and Sansa glared at him. Going behind a queen's back is treason, my lord, she said angrily. I never knelt to you, Lady Sansa. I did so to your brother, and only he can accuse me of such. What your brother said in the hall was right. At the time I, like others, was too proud to see it, not now. A crown means nothing compared to the North itself, and a kingdom can't exist without people. I'm sure there is a point to all of this, Lord Manderly, she said, sneering at him. Jon Snow knelt for his people. He gave up his crown for them. You need to do the same. Lord Wyman said, his words like an arrow to her heart. I will not. You may have stayed on your feet, but other lords knelt. They named me their queen. And they can and will choose to name another my lady. I have the support of the other lords. The men we brought won't fight for you, and so I came to make you an offer. Stand down for the good of the North, and I'll let you frame it any way you wish, as long as you don't disparage your brother or his queen. Stand down, and your name will be spoken of reverently as a good queen who cared for her people and did what was necessary to see them survive. And should I not? She asked. Then when your brother returns, we'll reject you publicly, and the North will speak much differently. When this war is over, my lady, you'll be the Stark in Winterfell. Far better to be a Stark people look up to than one they turn away from, Lord Wyman said, standing up. She watched him move to the door and felt her anger rise. How dare he, this man who'd not given them any forces to take her home back from the Boltons, who instead had just sat in his hall in White Harbor, how dare he demand she kneel? You have until the morrow, my lady, the other lords and I wish an answer by then. For the rest of the night she sat and plotted and planned, working out how to come out of this with her crown, and found to her dismay there wasn't any way she could without kneeling first. Men were fickle and oaths were not kept to. She'd seen that firsthand now more than once, but men were ambitious too. Today they'd kneel to her bastard brother and his Dragon Queen because they needed them, but what about tomorrow? What about once the threat was done? Making her way to the Great Hall, she felt the resentment build inside her. These men had done nothing when she was held in these halls. Most had done nothing when she'd come to them, and now they were doing nothing to stop her crown being taken away from her. Sansa had learned many lessons, and one had stuck with her. If you wait long enough, an opportunity will present itself to give you what you desire. Waiting is easy, knowing the perfect time to strike, that's a talent, Elaine, one I hope you'll learn. Littlefinger said. Learned she had, or at least she thought she had, and while Jon was on Dragonstone she'd struck. Allowed the lords to run her brother down, and for the worry, discontent, and resentment that he'd left them to begin to fester. She'd spoken of the Dragon Queen using Littlefinger's words about her beauty, framing it in worry for Jon, while leaving those she talked with worrying about what a bastard would give up to please a beautiful queen. She had waited and struck when the time was right, but she had underestimated Jon and assumed he'd act how he always did. His honor was his weakness, and his love for their family something that could be used against him. Next time she'd not make the same mistake, and as she entered the Great Hall to stand down as queen, she smiled. Retreat was not the same as surrender after all. Last Hearth 305 AC. Aegon. They passed Ned Umber on the way along with many other groups of people. The young lord of Last Hearth, the only one traveling north. They had skirted around Winterfell. Aegon in no wish to give Sansa any hope that he was returning, though it would be there they'd be heading to once their work north was done. Soon enough they were flying over the Dreadfort, and he could see people barring up the keep. Sansa's ravens not enough to force these people to leave. He sighed, knowing that he'd have to stop here also on their way back. Everyone between the wall and Winterfell was meat to the Night King's army, and unlike Aegon needing young, fit, able-bodied soldiers, the army of the dead had no such reservations. Old, young, fit or unfit, healthy or sick, it mattered not. To the Night King they'd be a soldier able to kill one of his. Where to Aegon they'd be a burden needing to be protected. When he saw Carhold, he was glad to see it mainly empty. The young red-headed girl on her horse marshalling the last remaining people was clearly young Allie's, and he would need to hurry her along. That though was a problem for another day, and today's lay a little further. Aegon pointing ahead so Dany didn't think this was the Umber's home. Last Hearth was built on a hill, a winding rocky road around it leading to the keep itself. Defensively, the keep would be incredibly hard to take if it were normal soldiers coming towards it. Men would be lost, arrows would fly, and a lord wishing to take it would see his folly and retreat. Unfortunately for the Umbers, it wasn't a normal army coming, and the keep would fall. Pointing to a large open space near the top of the hill, he followed Dany and Drogon when they landed, Regal landing close beside them. Dany, the dragons should rest here, not go on without us even to eat, he said as she climbed down off Drogon's back, Dany walking to the dragon and asking him to stay, and Aegon looking on as Drogon seemed to huff. Regal was more accommodating, Aegon letting the dragon know he was worried about him flying alone. He looked deep into his dragon's eyes and saw what looked like warmth there, something he felt through their bond also. They were soon joined by some men on horses, though they stayed as far from the dragons as they could while still being able to be heard. "Your Grace, we did not expect you," the large man said. Ardo Snow, Ned Umber's Castellan. Aegon remembered from his conversations with Davos. "Just a Lord Ardos. The Queen and I passed Lord Umber on the road. He travels here with horses and wagons, but he'll not reach you for a moon at least. You must depart now, Ardos. Walk, double up on horses, pack what wagons you can, but you must leave now." "Your Grace," Ardo said, acknowledging Dany before turning to him, "the people need an order from their lord, you my lord. I've tried to order them, but they await Lord Umber's return. Some don't wish to see the young lord made look weak, my lord." Aegon nodded. He knew that he was partly the reason for that. He'd forgiven House Umber their crimes and hadn't held the father's actions against the son. In doing so, he'd shown favor to Ned and elevated him even more than simply being his father's heir had. There would always be people trying to undermine a young lord or lady, and Ned Umber was no Lyanna Mormont. "Very well, Ardos, her Grace and I will ride with you to the keep and explain our wishes. Perhaps an order from mine or the Queen's lips would suffice," he said, and Ardos nodded. Ardos had one of the men give up his horse, and Dany climbed up on its back with no help. Aegon quickly climbed up behind her. He wrapped his arms around her as she took the reins and spent the journey to the keep whispering in her ear, trying his best to make her laugh and being surprised at her ability to keep a straight face. My queen is not amused, he whispered softly. Your queen is acting a queen, Jon Snow, she said, even though calling him by his name probably wouldn't have been overheard. Perhaps my queen is cold and requires me to warm her up, he whispered as he nibbled softly on her ear, feeling her move back against him. You do not play fair, Jon Snow, Dany said with a smile on her face. I play to win, your grace, he said as he kissed her cheek. Reaching the courtyard of Last Hearth, he was glad to see that at least made their preparations to leave. He helped Dany down from the horse and following Ardos in through the large wooden doors. Soon he found himself walking down a hall and into the great hall itself, finding a large open room full of people. Seeing him and Dany walk in, he heard whispered murmurs of the king in the north and Jon Snow. Some whispered Dragon Queen under their breath, though not with the same vitriol that others had said it since Dany arrived in the north. I've come from Winterfell with her grace bearing grave news. The wall has fallen and the army marches, and all of you must leave and leave now. Lord Umber travels here from Winterfell with wagons, horses, and supplies, but if he is to meet you here, then I fear it'll be too late for all of you. Aegon said loudly. What would you ask of us, your grace? A tall woman said, moving forward, the others looking at her as she did so. Aegon was ready to correct her when Dany stepped forward, looking the woman in the eye, and both of them getting the measure of each other. His grace and I would ask you to set off now, head for Winterfell and meet your lord on the road. Cut down the travel time Lord Umber has to make and hurry for Winterfell. Dany said, Lord Umber is truly on the road, your grace, the woman asked, looking to him. I passed him myself, my lady. Her grace speaks truly, but if you wait until he arrives, then you put all your lives at even more risk. I give you my word, set off. And set off now, and we'll shield you back. Aegon said, and the woman nodded before she turned around and seemed to move everyone to do as he had bid. It was early the next morning that they set off, a procession of people who'd move slowly but at least would be moving in the right direction. Once he and Dany made their way to the dragons. They had miles to go before they themselves could truly rest, and time was of the essence. They flew first to Carhold, finding the keep deserted, and so they flew further south to catch up with Alice and her people. Once they did, he told them to make haste for Winterfell, to push themselves, and made the same promise to them that he had to the Umbers. They rested up that night in a small cave on the Grey Cliffs, Drogon and Rhaegal flying over the Bay of Seals to feed before coming back and staying with them. It was cold and damp and the fire was pitiful, so he ended up trying to provide Dany with whatever warmth he could, finding to his surprise that she wasn't cold at all. After breaking their fast on some dried meat and bread, they took to the sky once more. They flew over Last Hearth and saw it was empty, and that so far at least the army of the dead was nowhere close. The flight to the northern mountains took some time, and when they got there, Aegon was annoyed to see none of the mountain clans had moved. Landing, they were quickly found by some guards, and the walk to the small keep that belonged to House Wall was a quiet, strange affair. The men with them said nothing, and Dany looked to him more than once worriedly, Aegon shaking his head to let her know they had nothing to fear from these men. Arriving at the largest building in the small village, they were given bread and salt and brought into the hall, Aegon looking around the room to see the large figure of Big Bucket Wall and some of the other heads of the mountain houses. Nori, Little, Knot, Harklay, Burley. All the chiefs it seemed had gathered, and he wondered why they'd not left, though he knew the mountain clans were proud men. The Jon comes to speak to us, we thought you'd forgotten about us, Big Bucket Wall said, his voice angry. Forgive me, Lord Wall, but why have you not marched? He asked to angry glares and raised voices. Marched, why would we march? Waited for you here we did, the Jon. Our men ready to fight to take back the Ned's home and rescue his daughter, and never did you come. March, we've been ready to march for you for more than a year. Morgan Little said, Forgive me, my lords, after I came back things were confusing. He said and saw the strange looks he was given, but why haven't you marched now, my lords? Surely my sister's raven explained the danger you're in. The Sansa has sent us no ravens, not when you marched, or when you were crowned, or since then. Torgon Flint said, his expression one of disgust. Aegon couldn't believe it. He'd not even thought of the mountain clans. Their numbers and experience fighting would have been invaluable to him in trying to take Winterfell back. Was it his death? Did it confuse him? Leave him forgetful, or was it something worse? My lords, the wall has fallen and an army of dead men march through it. Soon they'll reach the mountains and you alone won't be able to stand against them. He said, seeing their expressions hadn't changed. We know of the wall's fall, the Jon. We called this meeting to speak on it. This army you speak of, though we know not. Brandon Norrie said. He told them then of the Night King, White Walkers, and the army of the dead, telling them how Dany had brought her army and her dragons to help them defeat them. When he told them he thought Sansa had sent every house in the north a raven telling them to travel to Winterfell, he could see their anger. He felt his own too, though a lot of that was at himself also. How could he have forgotten about them, and could he really blame Sansa for doing the same? No, he could not. Why should we believe you, the Jon? We see the Dragon Queen and the dragons, but why should we believe you? Big Bucket asked. When I was at the wall, my lord, serving as Lord Commander, I brought the free folk through because of this threat. I traveled to Hardhome and watched as the Night King raised his hands and dead men moved once more. Wildings. Savages, he heard the disgusted voices of the clan leaders. The free folk had no love here, and yet amongst these people of all in the north, the lines between them were perhaps the closest. Men of the Watch, men I called my brothers, didn't think what I was done was right. Under the pretense of word of my uncle Benjen, they lured me out and stabbed me in the night. He said, and knew by the looks in their faces some had heard this tale. He began to remove his cloak, his gambeson, and finally his tunic, looking at them all as he did so. Beside him Dany smiled reassuringly, and he nodded to let her know that this needed to be done. For 3 days I was dead, and then I was brought back. Why, I don't know other than to think it was to fight this war. He threw the shirt down to the ground, standing bare-chested in the hall, each man in the room moving forward in his seat to look at him. Big Bucket stood up. The man's height, the only thing which made him look thinner than Lord Manderly. His large belly, though, didn't seem to slow him any as he walked over to him, and standing in front of him he looked into his eyes, and when Aegon nodded, Big Bucket reached out to touch the wound over his heart. The Jon speaks true, Big Bucket said as he made his way back to his seat. What would you have us do, the Jon? Morgan Little asked. Prepare your people and march to Winterfell, all of them, men, women, children, the old, and even the sick. The Night King cares not and asks only one question: does your heart beat? If it does, then you're meat in his army, so gather what you can and march, my lords, and march fast. I will march for the Jon. The Jon, another voice said. They ate warm food that night, Aegon looking as the lord spoke to Dany. There was no distrust or wariness from them as they did so. It was as if in accepting him they'd accepted her, and Aegon grew a little angrier that they'd not brought up a wedding sooner. Would the rest of the North have accepted her the same way if they were to be wed? Given what Lyanna Mormont said, what offer she'd brought them, it seemed they would. A fool, an honorable fool he'd been, and it had cost him everything. Closing his eyes, he tried to block the images, but they came anyway. The look in her eyes as he stabbed her in the heart. The look of hurt, betrayal, confusion, and sadness was one he'd sworn never to see on her face again. Opening his eyes, he saw her laughing as Big Bucket Wool and the Middle Little spoke, the large men seeming captivated by the tiny woman that sat beside them. The North remembers. He whispered softly, at least here in the mountains, that seemed to be true. They said their goodbyes the next morning, the mountain clans soon readying to leave, and he and Dany heading to the dragons. As they stood in front of Rhaegal and Drogon, he walked to her, seeing the smile on her face once more. These people, this is what I wished for Aegon, for them to want me here. Why them and not the others? She asked. These men are more honest, more true, proper Northmen who have not forgotten. He said, and she nodded. Aegon leaned forward to kiss her. Are you sure about this? She asked. We need to see it, see them. We'll be careful, Dany, but I have a feeling we won't need to be. He said, why? I just do, Dany. I think it's something this flight may prove. We leave if we need to? She asked, and he nodded. We leave if we need to, he said as he kissed her once more and watched her climb up on Drogon's back. Aegon turned and climbed onto Rhaegal's, leaning down to speak softly to the dragon, and then they were in the air, flying north towards the wall. The wall, 305 AC. Dany. She was a little reluctant to leave the mountain clans. Their welcome had been a boon to her spirit, and she, even after asking Aegon, wondered why the North had not felt the same way about her. While he had said that these men were truer and more honest, Dany wasn't sure that was the only reason. Thinking back now to how Sansa had welcomed her and what Aegon had said about his cousin, she began to be more certain that the well had been poisoned too, and had it not, then her welcome may have been different. Sansa had set her up to be made to feel unwelcome, to be distrusted, and possibly even hated. Oh, she had no doubt that some may have felt that way without any encouragement, and others may have been wary. Such was the nature of men after all. However, she was more and more certain that Sansa had whispered words and let it be known that Dany sought more than she said, that her motives weren't as pure as they seemed to be. As she flew, she wondered how things would have gone had Aegon not stood up. What it would have been like if he'd leaned more to his cousins than her. He was the reason she had come. Yes, she'd come to save people too, but without her feelings for him, then she'd perhaps not have, or certainly not until events in the south had been resolved. Would she have flown across the wall to save another? Given up her path to the throne, even if it was just temporarily? She found herself doubting she would. Had he then not shown he was completely on her side, she'd have found herself alone in a place where people hated her. Dany there! Aegon shouted, and she shook her head. Gods, she'd been thinking of this since they left the mountains, and now the wall was in front of them. She looked down and could see no signs of life. Aegon had told her they'd fly to the Shadow Tower and on to Castle Black itself. Feeling a chill, she wrapped herself up a little more tightly, and on they flew, soon finding ever more signs of abandonment. When Aegon went to land, she tried to shout to tell him no, and when he didn't hear her or perhaps add and landed anyway, she stayed in the air. Looking up at her, he nodded that she was doing the right thing and then moved into the abandoned castle. Though to call it a castle was a jape of some sort. That Aegon had been allowed to come to this place, his uncle allowing a prince, a king, to sign his rights away and be doomed to a life in a place such as this. Well, Ned Stark was lucky he was dead. It also made her sad to think that she had more kin here too, that her great-uncle many times removed had spent his life here growing old in such a cold, foreboding place. Dany breathed a little easier when Aegon came out of the castle. He had something wrapped in his hands which he stuck inside his gambeson. He didn't stay long on the ground either, and soon enough he was on Rhaegal's back and they were flying along the wall. Heading east to Eastwatch, she imagined. They were some distance away when they saw the first group of them. The army of the dead had truly breached, and she looked as Aegon seemed to stare at something in particular. Dany, fly high when I call, give them the fire. Aegon shouted, Dany barely hearing his words. Be careful. She shouted back as she did what he asked and watched him fly far too low. She saw them then, 3 pale white men on horses, and she looked on in horror as Aegon flew closer. The image of her son being impaled with a spear of ice forcing her almost to scream and tell her son to fly higher. But the spear never came, and Aegon instead unleashed Rhaegal's fire upon the horsemen. Dany looked on eagerly as the flames cleared. The men stood, their mounts having burned away, and she watched as Rhaegal set more dead men ablaze below her. Ilagan Drogon Doheragan Halekia. Down Drogon, help your brother, she said, and the dragon did as she asked. The 2 dragons laid down wave upon wave of flames on the army that marched below. Dany flew high when Aegon did, watching as he pointed forward, Drogon quickly joining his brother as they flew further east. Seeing Eastwatch, she was awestruck. Had she not been here before, she'd have been stunned. But she had, and looking at the large gap where a wall had once been, left her speechless. Again Aegon flew low, and she was thankful when he didn't land. More so when he flew high once more and pointed back south. It was over the gift that she saw it in the distance, a storm that couldn't be natural. She watched as Aegon flew close and pointed away from the storm and felt relieved for some reason that they were not flying into it. When they were sure there was no danger for miles around, they landed close to a stream, even though the dragons could keep flying for longer if needed. Dany herself could do with stretching her weary limbs, and rest couldn't do them any harm. She found herself giggling when she saw Aegon stab his sword into the water, once then twice, before she looked on amazed when he pulled up a large fish, watching on eagerly when he did so again a few moments later. After he filled his water skin, he then walked to where she sat. We're having fish then? She asked, smiling. Beats dried meat, and don't you wish for something warm in your belly, my love? He said, and she shook her head at the expression on his face and how his voice sounded. You're getting better at that. I don't know yet if it pleases me or not, however. Well, my duty is to please my queen, is it not? Perhaps I'll refrain from such talk until she's decided, Aegon said, sparking the flint and setting the fire. For now, perhaps your queen needs more talk to decide, she said with a smirk. As my queen commands, he said, leaning forward to kiss her softly. She smelt the fish cook and her belly rumbled. Aegon was right, warm food was certainly preferable to the cold, dried meat and hard bread, especially here in the cold of the north. When it was cooked, she practically devoured it, Aegon sitting laughing as he delicately ate his own. And just what is so funny? She asked with a smirk as she licked her fingers. I'm supposed to be the northern savage and you the well-mannered queen. It seems our roles have been reversed, my love, he said, handing her the half of his fish he'd not eaten. No, you should eat it, Aegon. I'm obviously less hungry, eat it please, he said, and she nodded reluctantly and then ate it anything but. When she was done, she took a large swallow of the cool water, finding it surprisingly more refreshing than if it had been wine. Then she sat back and enjoyed the warmth of the fire before turning to ask Aegon if what he had hoped to be proved had been. Aye, it has. There was 3 of them on that hill, Dany, and more than one spear. Why didn't the others throw some? He asked. I don't know, she said, shaking her head. Because they couldn't after he killed Viserion. When I was looking at him, one of them carried the spear to him. Why not use it themselves? Because only he could have thrown it, and he's not on the ground anymore, Dany, he's in the air, Aegon said, while it hurt her to think of her son's death. She remembered seeing that herself. He had thrown the first and then was going to throw the second. The others just stood there watching. Had she not just seen it with her own eyes, perhaps she'd have thought that it was the Night King who personally wished to do it. Now though, Aegon was right, and that changed things. They had nothing to fear from the ground, her children couldn't be hurt from there anymore, and she could feel the thoughts of what she would do to them now threatening to race away from her. The smile on Aegon's face, though, was one she welcomed when she saw it, as she could clearly see her was thinking the same as she. The thoughts she was having of burning them all weren't wrong, they were good, just as Aegon's had always been. We'll make them pay, she said determinedly. We'll burn them all, Dany, all of them, he said, and she smiled. They took to the air a little bit later, Dany feeling rested and as if a weight had been lifted off her chest. The idea that the danger came now from the sky was a worrying one, but in the sky, she could protect her children more. If the threat was there, then she'd be ready for it, and with Aegon beside her, Rhaegal and Drogon would see their brother at peace once more. Winterfell 305 AC, Tyrion. The ride back to Winterfell had been annoying, and arriving back without the queen with them even more so. Ser Jorah had insisted they move quickly, and so he'd been forced to ride with the main force of the Dothraki, and the Dothraki rode fast and hard. Behind them, Ser Davos, Missandei, and Grey Worm moved much more slowly, and he'd have preferred to ride with them. But he couldn't risk the Queen and Jon Snow having arrived and agreeing to things without him. He took comfort also in the fact that Varys looked just as uncomfortable as he, the eunuch, much more used to carriages, and yet he'd insisted on riding back also. Now though, as they rode in the gates, he was angry to see they'd not even come here themselves. Instead, they were off somewhere in the north on yet another fool's errand. Tyrion glared at the northern lords who awaited them, Sansa Stark standing with them and looking anything like a queen, and he knew then that what Lyanna Mormont had said was true. After being helped to dismount, he watched as Lord Manderly and Lady Mormont spoke, the fat lord's smile telling him that he'd heard what he'd hoped for. Lord Hand, Lord Varys, Ser Jorah, welcome back to Winterfell. I'll see that arrangements are made to have you and you men housed. Sansa said, her tone and expression very different than it had been, though her eyes remained the same. Lord Tyrion, Lady Mormont tells me their graces have flown north to see to the Umbers and Karstarks. Lord Manderly said, a question but not a question. Tyrion felt. They have, my lord. I had hoped they'd have arrived back by now, he said, and saw the brief bit of worry on the fat lord's face, something he had no intention of removing. The rest of our forces are behind us, Lord Manderly. We should begin to see about making spaces ready for them, Jorah said, though Manderly kept his eyes on him rather than the knight for a few moments longer. Of course, Sir Jorah, come. My own men will help settle the Dothrakian and find room for the Unsullied. He watched as the fat lord, Lyanna Mormont, and Ser Jorah, walked away with Varys surprisingly joining them. He then felt her eyes on him and turned to see Sansa Stark staring intently at him. "Lord Tyrion, I never got the chance to thank you for what you did for me in King's Landing," she said, smiling. "Nor I you for leaving me to take the full extent of the blame for Joffrey's death, my lady." He said, the annoyance in his voice not enough to make her frown or change her expression, not even her smile dropping, as it seemed that Sansa had learned to play the game somewhat at least. "You could have thanked Lord Baelish for that personally, my lord, though you'd have had to arrive sooner," Sansa said, her smile truer now. "I heard your sister killed him," he said, and saw the briefest crack. "We all killed him. Speaking of my sister, did she not ride back with you? Lady Arya is riding with the Unsullied, and the others the Queen rescued, my lady." "Perhaps we can speak later, my lord," Sansa said with a curt nod. "I'd like that, my lady," he smiled as he was led towards the keep. There was a time he was incredibly attracted to Sansa Stark. She had been right about that. The girl had been and was still a beauty. True, her red hair wasn't silver and her blue eyes didn't come close to violet. Yet that alone wouldn't have been enough to dissuade him. It was that there was something lacking in her. Something was different now in her than there had been when she was a younger girl. That innocence, naivety, and hopefulness was gone. The childlike wonder of knights and songs, of maidens and tourneys, was no longer there. Though he hated to admit it even to himself, it was that more than her physical looks which had attracted him so. He'd been with whores and paid for their company. He'd even taken a maidenhead once or twice, but never had it not been offered. Never had he been able to persuade with anything other than coin. Jaime could have, Jon Snow too, he'd have no doubt, but him, the imp, the demon monkey. No maiden would sleep with him of their own free will, none that he'd not have to cajole in some way. Coin, privilege, rank, or simply being a Lannister was all he had to offer. With Sansa it would have no doubt been the same. What she may have been willing to do to be free would still have been coercion of some sort. Yet he'd hoped and dreamt, and at one point thought it possible, and now that girl was long gone. He sighed as he turned and found Lady Brienne standing there as if she'd been waiting for him. "Lord Tyrion," the tall lady said, and Tyrion once again cursed his stature, the image of her talking to him enough to allow sneers and laughter around the yard, no doubt. "My lady, Sir Jaime, my lord, he arrived alone and was placed in a dungeon. I offered to fight for him after." "After what?" he asked, annoyed. "After Lady Sansa. After Queen Sansa, as she was then sentenced him to death." Felt his heart stop. Jaime sentenced to death. His brother was no wait, she said he was in a dungeon, didn't she? "Is my brother alive?" he asked worriedly. "He is, my lord, but I've not been allowed to speak to him. No one has. Lord Manderly ordered that no one could until her grace arrived back," she said, her voice showing her concern. "I thank you, my lady. I'll speak to Lord Manderly and see that you can visit my brother," he said, and she looked at him relieved. "Thank you, my lord." He walked off in the direction that Lord Manderly and the others had, wondering why Sansa hadn't immediately mentioned Jaime to him and just exactly what game she was playing now. That she wasn't cowed and beaten was clear. She may have lost her crown, but he doubted it had changed how she felt. If anything, it had probably reinforced her animosity towards the queen. He saw Lord Manderly standing with his guard. Ser Jorah and Varys were nowhere nearby, and the fat lord was looking out as the Dothraki raised their tents. Tyrion had to admit it was an impressive sight. All around him they were going up, and though it had been less than an hour since he'd spoken to the lord, some were already fully erected. Making his way over to the lord, he saw one of the guards move, and Lord Manderly turned his way. "Ah, Lord Tyrion, gods, these horse lords. I've never seen the like of it before," Lord Manderly said with a smile on his face. "They and the Unsullied, Lord Manderly, when it comes to things like this, they leave even the most highly trained Westerosi knights far behind. Lady Brienne informed me that my brother is a prisoner here. May I ask why, my lord?" he asked. "Sir Jaime was found guilty and sentenced to death by the queen," Lord Manderly said. "A queen you've since seen fit to replace," he replied pointedly. "A queen none the less, my lord. It'll be up to their graces to decide your brother's fate. For now he stays where he is." "I am my queen's hand, my lord. I'd ask you to release him to my custody." "No, no," he asked, annoyed. "Your queen is not my queen yet, not until she and my king have returned." Once they have, I'll be more than glad to defer to their wishes, but not until. Then, Lord Manderley said, looking at him, "May I see him?" he asked, defeated. "You may, but under guard, Lord Tyrion." Lord Manderley said, nodding to one of his guards and sending him off. He presumed to arrange it, walking through the keep. Heading to the dungeons, he felt his annoyance rise. He had disliked the north the first time he came here, the cold, the disdainful looks he'd received from the Northmen. Yet as a Lannister he seemed to get more respect than he had since his return as the Hand of the Queen. What was the use of power and position if no one respected one, and in reality, you didn't have the other, he thought bitterly. Soon enough he walked past the cells before finally reaching his brothers. "Tyrion," James said with a small smile on his face. "It's good to see you, brother." He replied, his own smile more muted. The gift 305 AC, Tormund. For 2 days and nights they'd run what was left of them anyway. If he'd had time to think or to make any sort of plan, it would be south to Winterfell and to his friend they'd have headed. The dead didn't give you time to think, though, nor the time to breathe, and the dead were coming. Tired, hungry, cold, he looked at the others with him. Other than those left at Winterfell, these were the last of the free folk. Less than 10 men, all that remained of those he'd brought with him to Eastwatch. Tormund knew what a defeated man looked like. He had seen it in their eyes after the Southern King had broken the greatest army the North had ever seen. In Mance's, when the Red Witch burned him. Though he had seen peace in his old friend's eyes too, when the arrow from Jon Snow hit. Now he saw it again, and if he had one of those things the Southern ladies spent their time prettying themselves in front of, he had no doubt he'd see it in his own. Despite the direness of the situation, though, he found himself smiling, his thoughts filled with blonde hair and blue eyes. These the right kind of blue, thank the gods. He sighed they could have had babies together. Great big monsters who'd have conquered the world. Hearing the sounds all around him brought him back to earth. Someone else, it seemed, would conquer it long before then. "Run," he shouted. He heard the screams as he lost more men he'd bled beside, some running beside him while others ran with Beric and his flaming sword. The woods they'd taken refuge in was perhaps not such a good idea after all, as around them the dead came from behind trees, and in the dark of the night everything looked the same. So much so that one of his men attacked a branch thinking it a dead man's arm, Tormund dragging the man away for it by the scruff of the neck. Then there was fire, and it was glorious, Tormund looking up to see the black shape of the Dragon Queen's mighty beast as it laid down the flames and burned countless of the dead. Small but mighty the Dragon Queen was, and though he could barely make out the dark shape of the dragon, she with her silver hair and white clothes was clearly visible on its back against the night sky. He saw the other one then, its green color easier to make out in the darkness, and then he shook his head. It couldn't be, could it? "Jon, down here," he shouted, waving his axe as the dragon flew over him and laid down flames once more. A few moments later he found himself fighting for his life. Though the dragons had taken care of most of the dead, they'd not been able to deal with those closest to him. Had they, then he may have been kissed by fire just like the mean dog was. His axe moved and a head came off, Beric's flaming sword taking care of another. Tormund felt himself being pushed to the ground and moved back to get out of the way of the club that was aimed at his head, only to see the dead man's head taken from his shoulders. "Get up, you lazy fucker." He heard a voice call down to him, and he laughed as he grabbed the hand that was offered, and he was firmly pulled to his feet. "My little crow," Tormund said as he embraced Jon Snow, the smile on his face covering up the relief he felt. "The others?" Jon asked as he looked at him, Tormund shaking his head sadly. "Come, this is not the place to talk. Looks like you're going for a flight on a dragon once more, Tormund." He walked with him to the dragon, the queen sitting on the black one as Beric, and some of their men climbed nervously behind her. Jon, him and the others walking to the green one. That they'd lost 2 more men was both not surprising and far better than it could have been, and Jon was right, this wasn't the place to talk. If it had been, then he'd be asking how he'd managed to tame one of the queen's beasts. "Sovgon Rhaegal, fly Regal," he heard Jon say, Tormund not recognizing it as the old tongue and wondering what words it was he was speaking, though the dragon taking to the air soon stopped him thinking about that. They were flying, he was flying. And this time on a dragon being ridden as if it was a horse by a man who had already conquered death once before. It wasn't long until he was laughing like a fool, and were Jon not so concentrated on keeping the beast in the air than he knew he'd have to answer questions. These he'd be happy to do as he thought of his beauty and the babies they'd have one day. He was confused when they flew east and not south. Though as dawn broke he was perhaps as happy to see it as he had ever been. Then he heard Jon say something to the dragon once more and they were landing on the ground, Tormund almost falling to the ground as he climbed down the wing. "Dragon Queen," he said with a large smile, one which got bigger when he saw Jon's frown as it looked like he was going to lift her from the ground. "Tormund, I'm sorry we couldn't get there sooner," the queen said, and he shook his head. "You and the little crow saved us, I owe you for that," he said seriously, the queen nodding. "You have my thanks to your grace, and you also, Jon," Beric said. "What happened?" Jon asked, looking at them both, all of it, the dragon especially. He let Beric tell the story, for once it was a tale he wasn't willing to tell, not yet at least. It didn't take him long to notice a few things. The queen was sad each time the dragon was mentioned, and Jon Snow was doing his best to comfort her. Tormund smirked. She'd stolen him after all, and thanks be to the gods he'd not tripped over himself to act otherwise. "Your armies," he asked hopefully, looking at the queen, Jon sitting beside her and holding her hand, "are heading to Winterfell," the queen said. "The crows?" he asked, knowing that despite his own feelings to Jon there were men there he still thought of as brothers. Castle Black was deserted, the stables empty, there were no bodies, so then they probably rode and are heading to Winterfell, Beric said, Jon nodding to him. "Eat, rest, we'll fly in a few hours," Jon said as he sent men to fetch wood and see if there was any food nearby. A little while later he found himself knee-deep in water, the fish slipping from his hands and the laughter thankfully the queen's and not Jon Snow's. Though he soon heard that too, his friend joining him in the water and using his sword to spear the fish he'd almost caught. "That was mine, you fucker," he said, looking at Jon. The smile on his face and the way he stood different than the normal straight face and hunched shoulders he wore most days. "It still is," Jon said, throwing it to the ground as he looked down and speared another. After eating, he found Jon standing by the dragon, just looking into its eyes and speaking to it softly as if it was that great big wolf of his. Tormund looked on fascinated as he did so. When he realized he was there, Jon motioned him over, and nervously he walked towards him, the large eyes of the dragon on him all the way. "I'm sorry about the free folk. Had I known, or if I could change it," Jon said, his voice low and the sadness and regret clear. "Are you a god, Jon Snow?" "What? Are you a god?" he asked once again. "No, then you could not change it. You asked, we went, you didn't order us to do so. My people follow who they chose, and we chose you. Those who are still alive chose you still," he said before quickly adding, "I'm still not fucking kneeling though." The laughter was true and loud, and he doubted he'd ever seen him do so before. True, he'd laugh at something funny and he'd seen him smile more than once. This was different though, and he was sure he knew why. "You and the Dragon Queen, you are together?" he asked. "We're to be married," Jon said. "Good, I like weddings," he said, wiggling his eyebrows, Jon laughing once more. "It's good to see you, old friend, truly, I'm glad you're with me." Always, King Crow. How long they'd been in the air when he saw them below he couldn't tell, though he could see Jon's relief when they landed. His own feelings on the Black brothers he could put aside for now, though he was happy enough for his friend. After watching Jon hug one of the men and speak to him and some others, they were soon back in the air and finally heading south. Winterfell and his beauty, he thought with a smile as he looked and caught Jon once again staring at the queen and her dragon ahead of them, laughing when the green dragon began to fly faster. Winterfell 305 AC, Sansa. She had not expected them to arrive so quickly, though given they were an army of horse-riding savages perhaps she should have. Seeing Lord Manderley's smile, she had wanted to see him gutted like the fat pig he was, the same with the little girl from Bear Island. Scowls and glares were all Lyanna Mormont ever shot her way, and to see her smirking as she spoke to Wyman and to her cousin was enough to leave her furious. Were it not for Tyrion's presence, she may have lost her composure. Her former, or was it, current husband, another thing she'd need to resolve going forward, would be key in what she planned to do. As hand to the queen, he was part of her inner circle, and Sansa was certainly bound to be anything, but she wondered how much Jon would shame her with it when he returned. For shame her he surely would, and her mother's words once again began to make more sense. "Bastards are lustful creatures, my love. They want what isn't theirs and will do whatever they can to get it. Never trust them or keep them too close, and never allow them to have power over you. For a bastard with power is the most dangerous thing of all." As a child, Jon had confused her. She knew quite clearly how her mother felt about him and her father, though he'd look at him often, never treated him as he did Robb, Bran, or Rickon. The smiles he did shoot Jon's way were more private, hidden things. Septa Mordane would echo her mother's words and Jane, and she would keep well away from him. They'd go so far as to cross the yard rather than risk crossing paths, and when they did, neither would speak to him nor even acknowledge his presence. She'd always referred to him as her half-brother, and created an invisible wall between him and her true brothers. Even Arya, who she often fought with, and who was the bane of her life, was to her someone she cared for more than Jon. Yet he, apart from being a bit sullen, he had never done anything to make her fear him as her mother said she should. He'd never even complained about her apathy or avoidance. That's what they do, Sansa, sweetling. They lull you into thinking you can trust them, and then they take everything you hold dead for their own. Her mother said as she brushed her hair. But surely growing up with us, he'd come to love us, to think of us as his kin. Bran or Rickon wouldn't try to steal Winterfell from Robb. Why would Jon? She asked, feeling the sting as the brush got caught in a knot in her hair. Demon Blackfyre was raised amongst his true-born brothers, Sansa. Raised in the Red Keep itself and knighted by his father's own hand, and you know what came after. The Blackfyre rebellions. She said, while she'd not learned much of history, the Targaryens had always fascinated her. Indeed, they're never happy with their lot, Sansa. That boy has been given a good home and raised well above his station, and would still demand far more than his due. Her mother's words had proved prophetic, and now what should have been hers by right had been stolen from her not once but twice. That it left her in a terrible position, only the least of her worries. The marriage that was being suggested could end any hope she had of holding a grip on the North. Should they have children? More than one, then he'd have an heir to sit in Winterfell as well as one in King's Landing when the Queen took the Iron Throne. She left her room and walked to the Godswood, though it was her brother and not gods she'd come to see. Bran was as usual sitting in his chair alone and looking at the white tree and its scowling face. Sansa, glad at least one of her brothers knew his place. "I can offer you no help," Bran's voice said. As usual, he was devoid of emotion and sounding very much as if he wasn't even a man at all. "I need to know what to do, brother, about Jon, about the Targaryen." She said the last word sounding bitter to even her ears. "Kneel," Bran said, and Sansa for a moment thought he was telling her to pray, so confused and without a plan, she was about to, and then she realized it wasn't the gods he was telling her to kneel to. "I'll not kneel to her. To him, not to them," she said angrily. "Kneel or be brought to your knees, those are the only choices you have." She stormed from the Godswood. Her brother was no help once again, and she cursed the family that had been left to her. Robb would have known how to handle Jon. He was better than him in every way, and there'd have been no question of him getting the better of her true brother. Though it would have left her no closer to her throne, she'd have welcomed his advice. Welcomed family that cared for her wishes. Bran was, she didn't know what he was. And Arya was even stranger than before, and if anything a bigger threat than ever. That her sister may be on Jon's side now wasn't lost on her, and she once again found herself cursing her decisions. She should have waited until she knew he had fallen at the Battle of the Bastards, and then maybe she should have allowed for Littlefinger's plans to take more shape. Though that would have cost her a sister, and she had felt it was right to do as she had done. At the time, at least. She'd picked Arya over Littlefinger, and once more she found herself wondering if she'd made the right choice. Had she chosen too soon? Should she have kept Littlefinger around to deal with Jon before she made her move? The second-guessing that she'd been doing ever since Jon had returned with the Dragon Queen was almost paralyzing her into inaction. As she walked across the courtyard, she looked to see the lords now all looking on. The Dothraki tents surrounded the keep, and she felt the walls closing in. She hurried to her room and called for a servant. She needed to act, to do something, to take back control of her future and fate. The longer she did nothing, the closer she'd be to spending a life on her knees, and she had promised herself that she'd never be placed in such a powerless position ever again. She began to write and called for a servant to deliver her message. After all, she knew this game and it was time to play. "You sent for me, my lady?" the young girl asked, and Sansa ground her teeth. "Only days before she'd have been called your grace." "I did take this to Lord Tyrion," she said, handing her the sealed note, the girl scurrying off to do as she bid. She sat there smiling as she began to work out what to do, the plans taking shape in her head. And then she felt a chill run down her spine when she heard a voice in her head. "When you play the Game of Thrones, you win or you die. There is no middle ground," the voice in her head said, the woman who spoke, now a queen, now herself. Greywater Watch 305 AC. Howland Reed. Life was a strange, mysterious thing, something that in all his years he'd never truly gotten to grips with. Its intricacies, contradictions, and the notion of his place in the great tapestry that the gods had woven. He was a lord and servant, a father and husband. And sitting in front of the heart tree each day as had become his custom, he felt he'd failed in every regard. He'd kept his promise to his liege lord and broken one to the woman who'd stood up for him. He'd done what his gods had told him, and it had cost him a son and the love of his wife. Howland had sat and waited, and in doing so had lost the respect of a man and a woman that he greatly respected. Why? Because they'd told him to. They had shown him what would happen had he done what he wished, and yet most of it had happened anyway. "Here and now, Howland, in front of this heart tree, I'll have your oath you'll not tell him the truth, that you leave up to me," Ned Stark said, the infant boy in his arms as he spoke. "He needs to know the truth, Ned, about her at the very least. And he will when I deem it so and not before. He's my nephew Howland, my blood, and it's my choice when Jon learns who he is." "That's not his name," he said, shaking his head. "It is now. Your word, Howland, lest I be forced to do what I do not wish. Your oath before the gods." "I swear I'll not speak of her to him before you do," Howland said, and Ned glared at his choice of words but accepted them all the same. He had thought it would have happened by now, that once he knew Aegon was safe he'd have told him the truth. And yet he had been proved wrong and had each day since cursed a man he'd thought his friend. He had saved Ned's life that day, and the more he heard about Aegon's life, the more he wondered if he had been wrong to do so. Had Sir Arthur lived, would Aegon have had a better life? Howland quickly began to think he might, and each time he heard about Jon Snow's own at Winterfell, the more sure he was of it. When he heard Ned had let the boy go swear his life away at the wall was when he realized that, far from honorable, Ned was in truth a liar, a traitor to his blood, and a man who picked his friend over his nephew. The depression he had felt knowing he had failed wasn't allowed to last too long as his gods called out to him. Howland doing just as they asked and sending his son and daughter to once again serve a Stark. All the while believing it was the wrong one he'd sent them to. Why, what was the point of it all? He almost shouted in front of the tree, not surprised at all when they refused to answer. The war had come and he'd sat and watched, events not for him to take part in. And yet through it all he had wondered about the what-ifs. What if Aegon had left the tower that day in Arthur's arms? What if he'd gone to Winterfell and broken his oath? What if Aegon had marched to war with his brother by his side? Would the Targaryens' old allies come to bear when they found out a son of Rhaegar's lived? And if they had? What if? When Galbart and Meege arrived battered, bruised, and in Galbart's case lucky to be alive, Howland had thought he was being given a second chance. That his gods had a plan after all, and though events had gone awry, things would soon be righted, and when his time came he'd go to them happy. King Robb named Jon Snow his heir. He legitimized him and were to head to the wall and see him released from his vows. "The men with us will take their oaths to replace him." Galbart said, "We've to organize an attack from the south, Howland. Take back the moat so the king can cross through the neck and march to Winterfell." "Once this damn wedding has taken place," Meege said. "You didn't want to attend, Meege?" he asked with a smirk. "Sup with phrase, were I a man I'd rather cut my cock off." Meege said, her disgust clear. And then once again while men plotted and planned, gods laughed, he thought bitterly. The news soon reached them of the Red Wedding, and Meege Mormont, a woman who'd stand and face an army alone with her mace, stood and broke right there in front of him. Daisy was her heir, her pride and joy. Everything she had hoped for poured into a living being, and she had fallen. The great Jon too, and so many others, all lost, and with them their king and his mother. Howland had not shared the news he'd received about what they'd done with Robb's body, of how they'd desecrated it with the head of his wolf. They were broken enough without thinking of that, Meej in spirit and Galbart in body. Both would recover, he knew, but he wondered if either of them would ever be the same again. As for him, he'd wept, shouted, and argued with his gods, forsaken them, beseeched them, and finally asked them to let the dead rest. He hadn't known Robb Stark, and yet he'd mourned him. What little he knew of Catelyn had only made him mourn the thoughts of the mother the children had lost, and not the woman herself. She, like Ned, he had spared no second thought to. Howland having accepted Ned's death as proof of what happens to those who break promises and who forsake their honor. "Father," he heard a voice and turned to see Mira, his daughter, now the last of his line. "Come, child, sit," he said, and she walked over to sit beside him, her face no longer that of the happy, sweet girl she had once been. "Have they given you an answer?" she asked bitterly. "The gods work in their own time, Mira. They've shown me many things since we lost Jojen. Terrible things and great things, things which make me dread each morning and things which give me hope for the future," he said. "Lately?" she asked, and he shook his head. "No, nothing since we were told to stay," he said. "I don't understand." He found himself laughing before he answered. It was one of the few things he had himself come to understand. It was not their place to. The whims and wishes of gods belonged to them alone. Their place was to accept their part and play their role or ignore it. Either was a hard road to travel, but whatever choice they made, the great game continued with or without them. "One day maybe we will." "Galbart and Meej are still arguing?" he asked. I don't think they'll wait, father. Word has come that the army marches back south," she said, confusing him. "What? I don't understand it either." "They marched to Winterfell. I saw them myself, father, the largest army the world has ever seen," Mira said. Howland felt some pride in the boy for that. Her boy had brought their saviors to them, and despite it all the gods had come through, even though he had doubted them almost every step of the way. "And now they march south?" he asked. "I and Galbart and Meej wish to march to join them." "Go speak to the Mira, ask them to wait the night. If the gods don't speak by then I'll not stop them." He watched as she walked away and sighed. She had been happy once, before he'd sent her on a fool's errand. Howland had known when Jojen fell. He'd felt it deep within his heart, and his gods had spoken to him even more clearly. Galbart had been getting slowly better and was almost fit enough to march, and though Meej was still hurt and damaged, she was eager to seek revenge. But his gods had shown him strange and terrible things and shared them with them both. They'd seen their houses fall and the north itself be overwhelmed. Meej had cried openly for the first time anyone could remember, as they'd seen a girl crushed by a giant. The only sound the woman had made was to speak a name he knew all too well. "Lyanna," Meej said as her tears fell freely. He'd seen the last of the Starks die alone beyond the wall, broken and gray as he'd walked off and gathered what strength that he had remaining to go hunting. That this was the end of a boy who should have been king was a travesty and an affront to the gods themselves. Her son deserved better than to sacrifice himself so others could eat, to willingly walk to his death so his share could feed someone else. The north itself was a wasteland, famine, hunger, wars, and bad decisions hastening its end, and the south didn't fare much better under a king who didn't care. Howland had seen images that horrified him: men, women, and children on fire. A woman looking into the eyes of the man she loved as she was stabbed in the heart. He'd seen a family turn on itself and a lone wolf dying as the snows fell and the white winds blew. "Why?" he shouted, just like he had then and just as they had once before. They answered, "The future is unwritten, and to control it takes time." The voice in his head called back, and Howland looked defeated as he looked to the face on the weirwood, its smile bringing back memories of a day long ago. "How long must we wait?" he asked, as he had done the last time, though this time he was far less willing to do as they willed. "No more, the waiting is done." The voice came back, surprising him so much he jumped to his feet. "Truly?" he asked. "The king awaits," the voice said. When he told Galbart and Meej, it was like he'd given a boon to their bodies and souls, Galbart looking fitter and healthier than ever, and Meej's eyes sparkling like they'd not done in May a year. Even Lyanna seemed happier, though that could have been down to his own expression, while Mira seemed eager to see Winterfell once more. "Where?" Meej asked simply as they rode from the neck. "Winterfell, Meej. It's time to crown a king." he said smiling. Winterfell 305 AC. Aegon, seeing Tormund had been a welcome thing, Ed just as much. Aegon's worry for them both something that had increased the closer he'd gotten to the wall itself. Were it not for their duties and obligations to the rest of the north, then he'd have flown to Eastwatch and Castle Black before Last Heart and the mountains. But instead, he had just hoped that they had survived, and it had been sums and not personal feelings which had won the day. They needed to save all they could, to remove the potential soldiers from the Night King's army before he got to them, before they could worry about the ones he'd already taken. So he had prayed, and his gods had answered him once again, and though he'd lost men, former brothers, free folk who'd bled for him in battle and men he'd considered friends, Tormund had lived. Ed2, even Beric he was glad to see, as his flaming sword could help greatly in the fight to come. They flew over the caravan of people that had left Last Hearth, the army of the dead at least a week behind them, and Ed and the knights watch racing their way. They'd reach them in a day or two, and as he motioned for Dany to stay in the air, he landed to tell them to expect them and that he'd be back to see them soon. He told them to keep on in their direction, and when next he came back he'd let them know more. "I'll keep them away from you, but march and don't dally. I'll let Ned know the same, and you'll have more wagons and horses soon," he said. "How many black brothers?" Ardos asked. "Almost 50. He said, and Ardos looked worried. "They carry their own supplies," he added, seeing the man relax. "Thank you, your grace. I look forward to your return. Give her grace my best." Mara, the woman he'd found out was acting as the Lady of Last Hearth, said, glaring at Ardos, and Aegon wondered if they were more than friends. "I will, my lady, be safe," he said as he climbed back up on Regal and took to the air. Allies was perhaps a week ahead of them, and Ned Umber another week ahead of her. Aegon doing the sums in his head and thinking he had 8 or 9 days until Ned was back with his people. He repeated his words to Allies and told her that there was no danger near, but that she should remain vigilant and that the Queen would return to speak to her in a few days. After speaking to Ned and reassuring the boy he'd be back, he let him and his men know that they could sleep easy at night, but to march fast, and then they flew to the mountain clans, and Aegon had to smile. If only the rest of the north was as hardy and true. The mountains were empty, the march to Winterfell well underway, and that night they rested and ate with the mountain clansmen themselves. "You wish us to travel with wildings, the Jon?" Big Bucket asked. "These men fought with me beyond the wall, at Hardhome, and then they marched with me to take down the Bolton scum. They've bled with me. The Ned used to say that we find our true friends on the battlefield," he said, looking around, and seeing the nods. "These men are my true friends. Then they are ours too, the Jon," Big Bucket said before smiling when Dany walked over. "Sit, drink you, get the Nuries a drink," he shouted to some boy who did as he asked. "I thank you," she said, smiling back at him when the boy handed her a horn of ale, Aegon looking at her as eagerly as the others when she drank it down in one go. Loud cheers going round from the other mountain clansmen. "The Nuries!" The cheers rose again when she slammed down the horn and welcomed another. He was soon laughing loudly as she told of drinking mare's milk with the Dothraki and of riding on a silver mare across the great grass sea. The Wall, the Little, and the Nori all listening eagerly when she told them of eating a stallion's heart raw. "All of it, the Nuries?" Brandon Nori asked, impressed. "All of it in one sitting," she said proudly to more cheers. As the night began to get chilly, she leaned in against him, Aegon's arm going around her as she fell asleep on his shoulder. He looked to see Big Bucket and the Middle Little staring at him, both men looking with what he thought was approval on their faces. The Nuries, he thought, and smiled. It was his fault after all. He'd said her name, and in his northern accent they'd thought that's how it sounded. That Dany didn't wish to correct and found it endearing warmed his heart. She had found a kinship with these gruff men that she'd not yet found with the other lords of the north. "She's a good woman, the Jon," Big Bucket said. "She is. The Wall were to be married in Winterfell in front of the old gods," he said to Smiles. "Aye, a good woman," the Middle Little said as he bid them good night. They said farewell to them the next morning, the men they were leaving behind seeming to have been accepted too. It in turn left more room on the dragons, and even though he still had Tormund and now Beric with him, Regal seemed happier with their passengers than he had been. Flying to the Dreadfort was taking them out of their way, but he needed to bring them south too, further south than most would think they were going if he had his way. Though they argued. It was clear more that they were scared that upon leaving they'd find no room for them once they got to Winterfell. Sansa's raven, when he saw it, almost filling him with rage. Able-bodied men, did she not care about the old, the sick, or the women and children? Was she so desperate to keep their stocks that she was willing to let people die? Was she so foolish that she thought men would abandon their families to uphold such a request? You have mine and her grace's word. Places will be found for you, food and warmth provided. Grab what you can carry and head south. His grace and I will be back to see you're safe. The dragons will fly and cover your back. I give you my word on that. Dany said, and Aegon saw the relief on their faces. A queen, a true queen, he thought, as they once more took to the air. Seeing Winterfell below him didn't fill him with the excitement it once had. It didn't feel like home to him, and he wondered if he'd always felt this way. As Regal landed beside his brother. As he spoke to the dragon and he and Drogon then took to the air to go and hunt, he was sure he had. He'd buried it deep down, though hiding it beneath his feelings of shame and unworthiness, but it had never truly been home. He knew that now. Around them the Dothraki had already set up camp, Dany smiling when Quhono came walking their way, and soon Tyrion, Varys, and Ser Jorah did likewise. Tyrion glaring at him, and Aegon couldn't resist smirking back at the dwarf, laughing when Tormund whispered in his ear, "The half-man looks like he wants to cut off your cock, Jon Snow." Tormund said, should he try, then he'd soon be a quarter man, or whatever a dwarf would be without a head. He replied, and Tormund laughed loudly, looking at Tyrion as he did so. He looked to see Jorah, almost checking Dany over to make sure she was unharmed, and even seeing wasn't enough for him. "Your Grace, all is well?" Ser Jorah asked. "It is. We've seen to the evacuations and found a few friends on the way," Dany said, and though he knew they'd think she meant the men behind her, he hoped she was speaking of the mountain clans. "And here all is well." "It is. Perhaps we can speak privately, Your Grace," Tyrion said, trying his best not to look to him. "Aye, that's perhaps for the best. I'm sure I'll be, and here they come now," he said, drawing Dany's attention to the northern lords that were walking his way. Dany looked to him and he nodded, and then turning to Tyrion and the others, she let them know they'd speak in a moment. Lord Manderly, Lord Surion, and Lady Lyanna all walking towards them. "Your Grace, it's a pleasure to see you've returned," Wyman said to Dany, his smile looking genuine and Aegon not seeing any reason to doubt it. "I thank you, my lord. If you'll forgive me, my counsel seeks my attention. Perhaps we can speak later, Jon," she asked, looking to him. "Of course, Your Grace," he said, and when he saw the briefest flicker of a frown on her face at his reply, he moved to her and took her in his arms. The kiss he gave her leaving her in no doubt of his meaning. "Forgive me, my lords. I find myself most affectionate towards my betrothed." "Then you're a lucky man, Your Grace," Wyman said, and he caught the surprised look on Dany's face. "Incredibly so, my lord," he said, and knew that he and Dany would need to speak later. He watched as the two lords bowed and Lyanna did likewise, and then he turned to the lords when Dany and the others had walked away, noticing how Varys held back a little, watching him eagerly before he joined the rest. "All went well, Your Grace?" Lord Wyman asked. "Am I? Is there not some ceremony needed?" he asked. "Aye, there is, and we'll have one, but you're our King Jon Snow now and always," Lyanna said, and he looked at her and smiled. "All went well. Last Hearth has been evacuated, Carhold and the Dreadfort too. We also flew to the mountains. The mountain clans have set off and are on their way," he said, and Wyman smiled. "Excellent work, Your Grace, though I'd have expected the mountain clans to have come already, the Dreadfort too." "As had I, my lord," he said, not willing to discuss the Raven here, know that he'd save for a far more public reveal. "I wish to apologize, Your Grace, for the welcome I offered the Queen," Lord Wyman said. "I'm not who you should apologize to, Lord Manderly." "No, but I'd ask you to accept it also. I'll apologize to Her Grace when next we speak." "Then I accept, my lord, as no doubt will the Queen." As they walked, he was told about their meeting with Sansa, how she had taken it, and how Lord Manderly had given her the option to do so on her terms, something he disagreed with but he could let pass for now. The North would know the truth of his cousin when it suited him and not before. When he heard about Jaime Lannister, he was torn. The man had kept to his oath, but he wondered how Dany would see it. The betrayal by Cersei, though, was something they really should have planned for. He wished he could turn back time, go back to Dragonstone and change her plans, speak to her, and convince her to attack King's Landing and secure the crown before they turned north. Had he done so, then they'd be in a much better position, and more people would be alive to face the coming threat. As it was, they still had 2 wars to win before they were done. "Sir Jaime is in the dungeon?" he asked. "Aye, he is, your grace." Lady Sansa ordered him executed, but Lady Brienne stood as his champion. "With the changes in things, I thought it best to await you and her grace's return." Lord Manderley said, "An excellent idea, my lord. Has he been kept isolated?" he asked, and Wyman shook his head. Lord Tyrion requested to see him. "I thank you, my lord. If you'll forgive me, I must speak with her grace. Perhaps later we can speak." "Of course, your grace." Lord Wyman said. "Lord Serwyn," he said, and the lord mumbled a quick "your grace," Aegon knowing he'd need to keep an eye on him. "Lady Lyanna, a moment please," he said, and the girl stopped. He waited until the others had gone and then stood there quietly for a moment looking at the girl. "I wanted to apologize, my lady. I didn't think how my actions would look and how they may be interpreted. Twice now you've sought to give me a crown. I already owe your family a debt I can never repay, and now even more so. I give you my oath there won't be any need for a third time, and just like the North, my lady, I remember. Should House Mormont require any boon of me now or in the future, should its lady have any request of me, I am and shall always be at your service. Just bloody keep the damn thing on your head this time," Lyanna said, walking away, "your grace." Aegon was still laughing when he reached Dany's room and still hadn't seen Sansa since he'd returned. Looking at Dany's face when he entered the room, he could see she'd been told about Jaime, and so he asked for the room to be cleared and took a seat beside her. "You heard?" he asked. "I should have known. What a fool I've been," she said sadly. "That makes 2 of us, Dany, 3 if you count your hand, 4 if you count Varys, 5 if—" "Aegon," she said annoyedly, though he was glad to see her smile was threatening to appear on her face. 6. He began, and she burst out laughing. He waited until she'd stopped before he began speaking again. "We'll beat her, Dany. We'll beat the dead, the Night King, and then Cersei bloody Lannister. She has the Golden Company," Dany said, and Aegon remembered he'd seen men in gold in flames, though he had thought them Lannisters. "Then we'll beat them how our ancestors did, how Daeron beat Daemon, and how your grandfather, my great-grandfather, beat Melies in the War of the Ninepenny Kings. The Golden Company has fought against our family before, Dany. Each time they've found only one thing," he said, looking to her, her eyes sparkling at the mention of their family. "Fire and blood," she said. "Fire and blood. What of Jaime Lannister?" she asked. "What do you want to do with him?" "He should be killed. His head sent back to his sister as a warning," she said, looking to him and seeing his face. "You don't agree?" "I agree, though I also don't wish to, because it's what Sansa wants. More than that, though, I think we should speak to him first. He knows things, Dany, things neither of us do." "About his sister's plans?" she asked, and he shook his head. "About my father, your mother. He knew them, Dany. Who else can we say that about?" She looked at him for a moment and then nodded, and he leaned in and kissed her, feeling her tongue touching his own and then looking annoyed to the door when someone knocked. "Who is it?" he called, and heard Ser Jorah's voice call back. "I should speak to him," she said. "I'll go to the Godswood, maybe picture a wedding of some sort," he said, and she slapped him lightly, a soft smile on her face. When what?" he said, and the slap he got was a little heavier. "I am a queen, Aegon. You tread dangerous ground," she said, her smile full now. "Would my queen punish me for doing so?" he asked, seeing the sparkle in her eyes as she pretended to contemplate something. Perhaps she'd deny you her company." "By the gods, that's not punishment, that's torture," he said as Jorah knocked again. "When Missandei and the others return and my queen feels ready, now does this gain me my queen's company?" "It does go, Aegon. I want you to speak to me of pretty pictures when we lay in our bed this night." "As my queen commands," he said, kissing her and walking from the room, letting in Ser Jorah as he did so. He was standing alone in the Godswood when he smelt the perfume. Varys' footsteps, far too quiet for a man of his girth. All that time slinking in the shadows, no doubt. He turned to look at the man and saw the smile on his face and knew then he had figured out the truth, some of it at least. I had never suspected before, though I know not why, and now it seems so clear. I find I'm incredibly annoyed with myself. Varys said, imagine how I felt, he said, staring at the man. He hid it well, kept you in plain sight, and maybe that was enough, though questions will soon be asked. Not if people don't speak, not if they can't, he said, and though it was a threat, he kept his voice calm and soft. You ride a dragon now, your grace, Varys said, and Aegon felt his anger rise, the man already picking sides. Dany is the queen, he said, moving towards the man, and you are her king. Trust me, your grace, I want what you do, Varys said, and Aegon stopped for a moment, anger giving way to doubt, and he wondered had they managed to win him over so soon. How can I trust you? I'm not the one you need to worry about, your grace. With you and her grace on the throne, the realm will be more secure than it has ever been before. Dragons, dragon riders, a just woman and an honorable man. It's the beginning of a dynasty, and one that I seek to see restored. I'm not as honorable as you think, he said bitingly. True, but just as honorable as the realm needs. Who should I worry about? He asked. Lord Tyrion and Lady Sansa, your grace. Some of the northern lords are still wavering, but Lord Manderly and Lady Mormont are true. And you, I am your grace's servant, both of you. He stared at the ground for a moment. The spider's words seemed true enough, but the man had gone against her once, thinking him a better choice, and threats to his person hadn't stopped him doing so. It was time to make a threat that would. What know you of the dragon's wrath, Lord Varys? He asked. After Queen Rhaenys' fall, Aegon and Visenya burned Dorne almost to the ground in their grief. Varys said, they did. Aegon made a mistake, though, my lord. Do you wish to know what that was? He asked, his voice sounding different even to him, something the spider picked up on. What mistake, your grace? Varys asked nervously. He stopped. He looked at the master of whisperers, the man who held countless secrets and had missed the biggest one of them all. That he had been the one to put it together wasn't a surprise. But to keep him on Dany's side was all Aegon cared about, even if it turned him from his own. My mother named me Aegon, my lord, so let me make one thing clear. Unlike my namesake, I'll not make the same mistake. If any harm comes to my queen because of you, if she should fall because of you, if you don't do everything in your considerable power to see that she sits the throne and nothing or no one get in her way, then I'll bring a wrath to Westeros that'll make the one Aegon brought seem like a boon. Your grace, Varys said, I see it burn, my lord. All of it, every last inch of it. When I'm done, the realm will be smoke and ash, and the doom of Valyria will be spoken of second in the great tragedies of the world. I reign with Daenerys, or she reigns alone. There is no third option. Do I make myself clear? You do, your grace, Varys said shakily. Good, then let's pray we never need to speak of this again, my lord. It's time to ensure that the future you wish for the realm is the one that comes to pass, is it not? It is. Your grace, Varys said with a smile, and Aegon knew he had him then. An ally that his queen could count on even against himself. Winterfell 305 AC. Dany. Though she wasn't in the mood to eat, she knew she had to, and that meant going to the Great Hall. Dany not sure she wished to sit with them all just yet. While they'd been welcomed differently than before, Lord Manderly and some others seeming especially keen to make amends, she still hadn't been approached by Sansa Stark. That the girl hadn't met them upon their arrival could be waved away and explained by the sudden nature of it. That she had not made an attempt to come and greet her since then was a definite snub. Dany was also missing, not having Missandei here. Ser Jorah, Quhono, and her Dothraki were her true supporters, but Missandei was her truest friend. There were things she could share with her that she'd not with any other, even Aegon. Her hopes, fears, and doubts, though the latter two were quickly being replaced with the former, thanks to Aegon and how unequivocal he was with his support of her. These she shared with Missandei and no one else. She also wished to speak to her friend about the things she was feeling, about her joy, and even the many things she and Aegon got up to, she thought with a smile. To ask her opinion on how she should handle Sansa Stark. Her original plans for the girl were now discarded. Dany had come seeking another friend, maybe with luck a sister, and after hearing from Aegon and Tyrion about the things that Sansa had gone through, someone she could relate to. Instead, she'd faced hostility and a girl who made it clear she wasn't just unwelcome, but the mere thoughts of her here filled her with disgust. It was a feeling Dany knew well. She remembered it from when she was a child and she and Viserys begged for safety and were denied. She had seen it on the faces of the 13 in Karth and in the eyes of the masters in the Bay of Dragons. More recently she'd seen it in Cersei Lannister's expression, and she wondered had Sansa picked it up there. Though given how Aegon spoke of his cousin, she began to think the girl had gotten that particular expression from her mother. "You're not dressed," Aegon said, his voice sounding playful, and she smiled as she looked at him enter the room. "My king is wise indeed, seeing a half-naked woman and coming out with such a witty comment. My queen is lucky she's only half-naked, or I'd have not spoken at all before I ravished her," Aegon said, grabbing her and making her laugh. Though she welcomed his kisses and enjoyed the look of desire in his eyes, her traitorous stomach decided now was a good time to let its own desires be known. Dany, looking at Aegon embarrassingly as the rumbles her stomach made sounded like one of Drogon's roars, something that Aegon picked up on and began to tease her about. "Is the dragon hungry?" he asked with a smirk. "Aegon," she said back, trying her best to seem annoyed, the smile on her face not helping her case. "My queen desires sustenance. Were we beyond the wall, I'd be forced to go on a hunt. Days I'd be gone before I returned," he said, his own smile threatening to become a full one now. "Thank the gods then the kitchens are so close," she said as he laughed. "I'll go bring you something," he said, kissing her cheek and moving from the bed. "Aegon, do we have to eat in the Great Hall?" she asked, not wishing to do so. "You are a queen, my love, your wish is all that matters. We can eat here alone if that's what you want." "I'd like that," she said, smiling as he kissed her again. That he didn't send a servant to fetch the food both annoyed her a little and warmed her heart so very much. True, he hadn't gone hunting, but he was signaling his willingness to do so if she asked. The tray he brought back was full, and she licked her lips when she saw it. She quickly found herself sitting by the fire as they ate on the floor, the warmth and coziness of it something she enjoyed immensely. That she was ravenous was a shock to her. Aegon even leaving halfway through his own meal to bring her some more, and she found herself questioning why she was so hungry. "Maybe it's the cold, my love, the change in weather," Aegon said, and she nodded though she wasn't sure. "How was the godswood?" she asked. "Not as pretty as I had hoped, though maybe that was the company. Lord Varys is a poor substitute for who I'd wish to be meeting there," Aegon said, looking at her. "And what did my master of whisperers wish with you?" she asked, Aegon looking at her and seeing it was curiosity and not doubt that had made her ask the question. "Apparently flying on a dragon is not conducive to keeping a secret. He knows who I am," Aegon said, and she looked at him nervously. "He's on our side, yours completely." "How can you know?" she asked, her nerves clear now. "He's betrayed those he served before." "Because I threatened what would happen should he do so again," Aegon said. "You did," she said, smiling, thinking of her own thereat that she'd made to the man. "I told him that we reign together or you reign alone. There is no other choice," Aegon said, and she gasped. "Aegon, he needs to know that at the end of this you'll be Queen Dany, that I'm not an option for him unless it's by your side." "And you, what if he feels the need to betray you?" she asked worriedly. "Then my queen will keep her word, will she not?" he said as he handed her the glass of wine. She looked at him and nodded as she sipped the wine, worried though she was that he may be putting himself at risk for her. That he cared for her so much only made her love him a little more, but she had no desire to reign alone either. She had lived that way for far too long after all. "I don't want to be queen without you," she said after a few moments. "You won't be together, Dany, always," he said, and she nodded, kissing him deeply. Always. When she felt her stomach settle, it was a different hunger that soon took over, her hands soon traveling to Aegon's breeches and up the inside of his firm, muscular thigh. She felt him immediately. He was already hard for her, and she smiled, glad to see his desire for her was just as strong as hers was for him. Hearing him groan as she stroked his length through the tight leather made her even more eager to see them removed. Though before she had a chance to reach the ties which held them, she was scooped up in his arms and taken to their bed. She could see in his eyes what he wanted, but her own desire was threatening to overwhelm her. And so when he laid her down, she grabbed him and rolled on top of him, pushing him back down onto the bed when he went to rise. "No, my king, tonight I'm in charge," she said, her voice almost hoarse, so excited was she, more so when she saw that deep purple of his eyes. "This off," she said, pointing to the tunic and shirt he wore, smiling when he practically ripped them both from his body. Slowly, she took his boots off, and then when he went to take his breeches off himself, she slapped his hand away, smiling all the while. "Mine," she said, and the purple flashed once more. Inch by agonizing inch the breeches came down, and then his small clothes followed. She almost licked her lips as she looked at him lying there in all his naked glory. She could see now why Aegon would stop to take in the sight of her in her nakedness, why it excited him so much to see her laid out in front of him. "Touch yourself," she said, and when his hand went between his legs instantly, she felt the moisture between her own. Jealously, she looked at his hand as it stroked his length up and down, rhythmically, sensually, which surprised her as Aegon took his time, his movements slow, allowing her to see it fully. When she looked at his eyes again, she almost gasped. The gray was practically gone and the purple all that remains, and she found she could wait no longer. "Stop," she said as she removed her own clothing, and then as he placed his hands on either side of himself, she climbed onto the bed and moved up between his legs. She bit him gently on the knee, and hearing his gasp did so a little harder on the inside of his thigh, her eyes never leaving his as she moved closer to her goal. When she reached out her hand to take hold, she delayed it just for the briefest moment, enjoying the almost sad moan that came from his mouth and the groan which came a moment later as her fingers wrapped around him. Just like he had, her hand moved slowly as she stared at every inch of his manhood before she moved forward. "Dany," Aegon said, his voice pleading as her tongue touched the tip ever so slightly. It took everything in her not to just swallow him whole, his scent. How he tensed when she blew on his cock as she licked it once more, and the taste of him all begging her to do what both of them wished. Yet he had teased her at times too, and turnabout was fair play. So she took her time until she heard him beg, "Dany, please." That was enough for her, and so she opened her mouth and took him inside, just the head at first, but soon both Aegon's need and her want combining, and then she was taking more and more of him into her hot, wet mouth. Yet soon even that wasn't enough for her, and to a low groan and an almost despairing look from Aegon, she lifted her head and looked up at him, smiling as she climbed up on top of him and lowered herself down. The noise he made was one she welcomed, the feel of him as he slid inside her ever more so. She reached out her hands and placed them on his chest and began to move up and down. The time for teasing was over, and her own needs were just as great as his. Very soon she found a rhythm, and her moans were as loud as his. When he grabbed her hips and began to move up to meet her, she almost squealed. The noise of their bodies slapping together was loud enough to be heard around the entire keep, she felt. When he sat up and began to kiss her breast, she slowed down, her hands going to his head and directing him where she wanted. Though the movements were less hurried, it felt just as good to her as if he was reaching deeper inside of her, and when he looked into her eyes, she felt the pressure build. "Dany," he said again, looking up at her with such a look of want that it took her over the edge. Aegon soon following as she collapsed against him and then down onto the bed. "I love you," he whispered when he got his breath back, her own still hurried and frantic. "I love you too." She woke up early the next morning wrapped in his arms, and she had to almost fight them off her, so tightly and protectively did he hold her. After getting up and using the privy, she felt her stomach rumble once more. Walking back into the room, she was glad to see him awake, an almost worried look on his face until he noticed her. "Morning, my love, sleep well?" she asked playfully, only to be grabbed by the hand and dragged to the bed, her laughter ringing out loudly around the room. "I did until you got up," he said as he nuzzled her neck. When her stomach rumbled once more, Aegon let her go and he got up from the bed himself. She watched as he quickly dressed before walking to the door. Looking back, he smiled at her as he left, and she lay back against the pillow. She didn't have long to wait as he was back in mere moments, and the food he brought she once again devoured. With Missandei not here she did her own hair far less elaborately than usual, though given how Aegon looked at her it seemed he liked it all the same. "Are you ready for this?" he asked, and she nodded. "I am." Taking her hand in his, they walked from the room, and with her 2 Dothraki guards joining them, they headed down the corridor and then out of the keep itself. The cold air hitting her woke her up completely, and she was no sooner out of the keep than Tyrion and Jorah made their way over. Dany sending the former away for now and asking the latter how they'd been welcomed, pleased to find it had been much different than before. The door Aegon brought her to had guards wearing Stark colors guarding it, both men moving out of the way as soon as she and Aegon reached them. Walking inside, it was clear to her both how cold and how foreboding this place was, and soon they passed even more guards. "The Kingslayer, where is he?" Aegon growled at one of the men who mumbled something in return. When they reached the cell they'd been directed to, Aegon stopped and looked her in the eye before squeezing her hand and then opening the door. Dany following him inside and trying not to smile when he stood in front of her just in case the Kingslayer tried anything. Jaime Lannister looked far different than he had in King's Landing. He seemed far more tired, and when he saw them there she noticed how concerned and worried he looked also. "My queen wishes to speak to you, Sir Jaime," Aegon said simply. "The road to Winterfell 305 AC, Sir Davos," the boy was different and had been since they'd arrived in the north. Though given what he'd found out about himself, it was the least to be expected. Davos, when he thought about it after he found out the truth himself, worried about how it may affect him. Other than Stannis, he'd not met a man so bound by duty, by honor, and so blind to the way the world didn't conform to either than Jon Snow. He respected him greatly, and yet he wished he'd see more of the gray in the world, that he understand more the blurred lines between black and white. He worried too about his relationship with the Dragon Queen, and how this news may affect not just how the Queen thought of him, but just as importantly how Jon thought of her. Tormund had told him about Ygritte, and how he had loved her, but his sense of honor, duty, and loyalty to those crow bastards who stabbed him. Tormund's words, not his, had forced him to forego love for duty. That Jon carried around an air of sadness that was deeply ingrained in him was clear to him, and he worried that he'd do the same thing again. Pick duty over love, give up what he could have for what he thought was the right thing to do. But the boy was different. No longer did honor or duty define him. No longer would he deny himself that which he deserved, and Davos was happy for it. The world needed a just woman and an honorable man, true, but not at the cost of them both, not if it kept them apart and forced them to suffer because of it. Something he was more than pleased that Jon seemed to understand even better than he did. "You know, Lady Stark hated my presence here. I was the bane of her existence, the stain on her husband's honor, and since she couldn't hate him for it, she hated me. It wasn't your fault, Jon. Oh, I know that. It was my so-called honorable uncle's fault. Not that it would have made a difference, bastard, true-born, prince or peasant, she'd not have cared. It took me a long time to realize that it wasn't what she thought I was that was her problem, it was that I was at all. Jon, my presence threatened her children, be it in her own mind that I was a bastard who'd steal their inheritance, or be it in her husband's eyes, that he may look to me more than one of them. Out on the sparring ground, should I beat my brother, or in our lessons, should I prove myself more clever? Even when Arya showed more favor to me than she did to the others. My presence threatened her children, all of them, one of them, none of them, it didn't matter to her which. We can't be responsible for how others see us, Jon, only how we see ourselves. Davos said, and Jon chuckled. Aye, but because of that, how she looked at me, how she felt about me. Because of that I saw myself how she did, lesser, unwanted, unwelcome, unloved. The woman was a fool, Davos. Between her and my uncle, they together caused my family to be torn apart. Had they not, then who knows where we'd be today. Family, duty, honor, those are the words of House Tully, the words Lady Stark claimed to live by. Aye, he said, not knowing where Jon was going. I did my duty and they killed me for it. I went to the wall for honor, my uncle's and my own, and everything I believed or had been led to believe about the honor of that God's forsaken place was proved to be naught but a lie. Jon, family, Davos, that's all that matters. Fuck duty, fuck honor. A wise man once told me something, may things in fact. Jon said, smiling, What is honor compared to a woman's love? What is duty against the feel of a newborn son in your arms? Or the memory of a brother's smile? Wind and words, we are only human and the gods have fashioned us for love. That is our great glory and our great tragedy. No, a just woman and an honorable man weren't what the world needed. A man and a woman who loved each other and would face death to be together. A man and woman who would stare it down and shout, "Not today," that's what the world needed. Davos was glad they'd finally found them, as the thoughts of the world without them was not one he'd care to think about. As he looked at the dragon he'd been whittling, he heard the high-pitched scream and jumped to his feet, running off in the same direction as the Unsullied. "Missandei, Missandei," he heard Grey Worm shout as he ran after him. They found her by the stream, and thankfully she was unhurt, which was more than could be said for the shadow cat that lay but a few feet away. Davos could see it had basically been torn apart, and as he looked closer at the woman he saw the white fur of Ghost standing protectively beside her, the wolf's snout and fur covered in blood. "What happened?" he heard Arya Stark say, and Grey Worm glared at the girl. He knew she'd made inroads with them, with Daenerys' people, as he'd seen her speak to them and to Missandei most of all. Arya asked questions about the queen which the woman was only too happy to answer. Yet she was still, to some and especially at such a delicate moment, an outsider. She was part of the people who'd welcomed them so poorly, and her question was met with suspicion and anger, rather than be taken for the concern she actually asked it with. "Missandei," he asked, stepping in. "I came to make water. This thing came at me and then the wolf came from nowhere and saved me." Missandei said, still shaken. "Ghost saved you?" Arya asked, and Missandei nodded. Grey Worm helped Missandei back to their tents, and Davos looked on as Ghost followed behind them, the wolf acting as an unofficial guard of sorts. He looked to Arya, who was looking at the shadow cat and at the white wolf as it walked away, a small smile on her face which she quickly removed when she saw him looking at her. They walked back together, and though they didn't speak, Davos felt there was something the girl wished to ask him. "Missandei is the queen's closest friend and confidante. She's like a sister to her, and Jon knows how much she cares about her," he said, and though the girl didn't answer he knew she'd heard him. By the time they reached the outskirts of Wintertown, Davos noticed how much more often the two girls spent in each other's company. Arya was even laughing more at some of the stories Missandei told of their time in Essos, and scrunching up her nose when certain dishes were mentioned. Hearing her laugh as they spoke of honeyed locusts and horse meat, and how she was happy that being back home meant more of the food she grew up with, was strange to him, though he welcomed it all the same. Whatever doubts she'd had about how the queen was thought of, seeming to have been laid to rest by just how closely the White Wolf stayed by Missandei's side. Winterfell 305 AC, Jaime Lannister. It was somewhere in the second week of being locked in a cell, he thought. Though days were hard to count when your mind was troubled. Seeing Tyrion had brought him some comfort, and yet his brother's words that he'd speak to his queen about him did not. After how he was welcomed by Sansa Stark, he doubted Daenerys Targaryen would welcome him any better. Less so when he told her just what exactly his sister had done. Despite Tyrion's warnings not to, Jaime knew he must. Should he end up facing his death, then he'd like to do so without lies on his lips for once anyway. The guards mocked him, and he found their words to have no effect. Not until he was told that Daenerys and Jon Snow had returned, and then he did actually begin to worry. It was a strange feeling expecting to die. As a swordsman and a man who'd led men into battle, you'd think he was used to it. But Jaime had never thought he could, if he was being honest. There wasn't a man alive other than Barristan Selmy as good with a blade as he, or at least there hadn't been, he thought, looking to his golden hand. So facing men in battle had never felt like there was even the chance he could die. Now, though, he knew there was every certainty that he would. That night, though, he slept like a babe, and when he woke the next morning he felt hungry and ready for the day ahead. He remembered something that Arthur had said to him once. Among the many things the Sword of the Morning had told him, this one had always stuck out. Fear accompanies the possibility of death. Calm shepherds its certainty. So when the door opened and Jon Snow stepped inside, when Daenerys stepped inside looking every inch her mother, Jaime felt the calmness wash over him. "My queen wishes to speak to you, Sir Jaime," Jon Snow said, standing between him and Daenerys, ready to cut him down should he make a move towards her. The boy had nothing to fear from him, though, as Jaime was resigned to his fate. "Your sister pledged to send her army north. She did, he replied. I don't see an army, do you, Jon? Daenerys said, no, my queen. I see one man with one hand. It appears your sister lied to me. Daenerys said. She lied to me as well. She never intended to send her army north. She has your own Greyjoy's fleet and 20,000 fresh troops. The Golden Company of Essos bought and paid for. Even if we defeat the dead, she'll have more than enough to destroy the survivors. Daenerys asked. I promised to fight for the living. I intend to keep that promise. He said, meaning every word. He looked at the two of them. Jon Snow looking at the queen, and yet he knew that his eyes were on him also, and Daenerys, whose expression he couldn't make out. Her breathing was calm and steady, and whether it was anger, resentment, or judgment in her eyes he couldn't tell. You'll be removed from this cell and face trial in the Great Hall. Speak up for yourself, Sir Jaime, but speak nothing more on the Golden Company or your own Greyjoy. Daenerys said, am I to be executed? Why would I do that? Daenerys said as she stepped from the room. Even a one-handed man can fight, Sir Jaime, and fight you will. Daenerys said, moving away. Jon Snow staying back for a moment and looking at him. My queen is giving you a chance, Sir Jaime. When next we speak, you'll tell her of her mother and her brother. Ask her about Sir Barristan and let her tell you what the bold thought of her. Jon Snow said, stepping out of the room. It was an hour later that he was taken to the Great Hall, looking to see that the Queen, Jon Snow, and both the Starks sat near the high table. Tyrion looked at him worriedly, and Brienne watched with concern in her eyes. He stood in front of the table, standing there for what felt like an age, waiting for someone to speak. The Northern Lords looked to Jon Snow, to Sansa Stark, and finally to Daenerys. Sir Jaime, you were found guilty in a trial before our arrival. However, after hearing from those present, I find you have no case to answer for those perceived crimes. Daenerys said, and Jaime looked to see the angered look on Sansa Stark's face and the surprised one on Tyrion's. I thank you, your grace, he said softly. I had expected an army, Sir Jaime, as per our agreement in King's Landing, yet your sister has seen fit not to send one. I take it she's reneged on our agreement. Daenerys said, and Jaime for a moment thought to answer how he had earlier, only to see Jon Snow give him a nod and then a shake of his head. My sister never intended to live up to that agreement, your grace. Indeed. Daenerys said, looking to Tyrion, yet you came anyway. Why? I intend to live up to mine. He said, you intend to fight for her grace. Jon Snow said, and again he nodded. I came to fight against the dead with her grace, he said, and saw the queen smirk. Very well, fight and fight well, Sir Jaime, for we have need of every man to defeat the Night King, even a one-handed one. Daenerys said to laughs. He was surprised to be handed his sword back, and then he watched as Sansa Stark stormed from the room, as Jon Snow helped the queen to her feet and they walked to speak to the fat merman and to the little she-bear. Jon Snow speaking while Daenerys held his arm and joined in, both of them serious and then very much not, and when he saw it he almost couldn't believe it. He blinked and looked again only to find it wasn't there. That brief moment though was one he couldn't let go even when Tyrion and Brienne walked over to him. He was certain he'd seen a deep purple in Jon Snow's eyes, and as Brienne and Tyrion spoke, Jaime found himself looking to see if that was all he saw. Winterfell 305 AC. Bran. It had been strange since they'd arrived, the things he'd seen happening all taking place in front of him rather than in his head. The line between what was real and what could happen blurring every single moment, and Bran finding he couldn't quite keep up. He'd seen Viserion be resurrected and claimed as the Night King's mount, the wall falling, and the army of the dead passing through it, and Jon knocking at the door while on a ship. He'd watched as they'd marched through the north heading to Winterfell, and everything seemed to be happening how it should. Sansa was acting just as he'd seen her act, her desire for a throne outweighing everything else, and Arya was desperately trying to cling onto who she was. So much so that she had chosen her sister over her brother even without thinking she had. When they arrived at the gates he was certain what came next, and so he readied to play his own part, only to find he was wrong. Jon acted differently, his actions not the ones he'd seen, and it confused him as much as the words he spoke to him before he left the courtyard with Sansa. You speak to no one about me, no one, Jon said. So he hadn't, his place was not to interfere after all, but to watch and ensure events played out, and so he sat back and did what he was supposed to do. A small change though can cause large ripples, and his world quickly began to spin in directions he wasn't sure of. The Night King fell and he didn't, he lost. He won, Sansa, Arya, and he died, and then they didn't, and Bran wasn't sure what he was seeing. He looked into Jon more, following the thread and seeing where it took him. Did he know? No, he couldn't. Bran had seen what he did when he found out the truth, and he was doing anything but that. So it was something else that was causing the change, and he needed to find out just exactly what it was. The future he'd seen must come true. It was the only way they all lived, the only way the pack survived. Sitting in the meeting with the Northern Lords, he watched as it played out just as it once had. The little course correction that Sansa had done by calling the meeting was one that seemed to have worked. He sat there watching and yet drifting at the same time. Again he looked forward and watched as the Night King fell to Arya's blade, as Sansa was named queen in the north and he the king in the south. He saw Arya sailing off on a ship while Jon was sent to the wall, and the world was right once more. So lost was he in the vision that he didn't even notice when things went awry in the hall, and only when he saw Sansa fall, saw himself fall, did he realize that something different had happened. He opened his eyes to see Jon was now standing in front of the table, and he knew that wasn't supposed to be how this went. I brought you 2 armies, 2 dragons, dragonglass, and a queen that none of you fucking deserve. Watch closely now as I take them all away, Jon said as he took Daenerys by the hand and walked from the room. As he sat in front of the weirwood, he watched the armies march up the road, south and not north their direction. He searched further and saw Winterfell fall, the Night King's blade piercing Sansa's heart, Theon being cut down by whites, and himself sitting in front of a tree as the Night King walked towards him. He pushed past his own death and saw the battle at the neck. The 2 dragons working as one to take Viserion down, all 3 of them crashing to the ground. Jon was cutting down White Walker after White Walker who tried to get to his queen before helping her up on a dragon's back and telling her to lay fire down on the dead. He looked on as Arya was swarmed by the dead, as Jon moved forward and Drogon and Regal cut a path of fire from him to the Night King. Jon then rushing forward and dipping the sword in the flames, bringing it back up with it alight, and he felt it then. The fear in the Night King's cold heart as the blades crashed together. One icy white, the color of the moon, the other a flame burning so bright it was hard to look at, though its red light gave it an unearthly hue. Bran watched as the song of ice and fire played out in front of him, and what a song it was. When the Night King fell, so too did the army, and he watched as Jon placed Arya's body on the pyre, as he set it alight, and yet looking around there were far fewer pyres than he'd seen before. He watched as they marched to King's Landing. The Unsullied almost intact, the Dothraki far stronger, and the Lords of the North and the realm united behind them. The Crow's eye fell and the Mad Queen was beaten, and Bran looked as Jon sat on the throne, a crown on his head and a smile on his face, when Daenerys sat on his lap, her swollen belly caressed by his cousin's hands. No, no, this is all wrong. His voice screamed out inside his mind. He looked north and saw the statues in the crypt, Sansa's, Arya's, and his own. Rickon's too was there beside Robb's and his father's. Once again he was taken from his thoughts, though this time by his sister, and he could see the pleading look on her face. I can offer you no help, he said. I need to know what to do, brother, about Jon, about the Targaryen. Sansa said, her voice that mix of anger and bitterness he had come to hear more often when she spoke. Kneel, he said. I'll not kneel to her, to him, not to them, she said angrily. Kneel or be brought to your knees, those are the only choices you have. When she left he looked again and saw it once more, Sansa crowned queen in the north, him crowned in the south, and Arya sailing off on a ship, and Jon riding out beyond the wall. He saw the small smile on Jon's face, and he felt relief that it had once again righted itself. The world proceeding how it was meant to, and so he relaxed. The Queen's return, Jon's return, even the trial in the Great Hall, all seemed part of the whole, and as he closed his eyes once more he prepared to see the future that he had planned so carefully. When the snows fall and the white winds blow, the lone wolf dies, but the pack survives, he said softly.